Thank you very much, Sir Robert. I also want to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me and the University of Tallinn for the support. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to participate in presence, but nevertheless happy. I'm happy and honored to have the chance of discussing some thoughts with such a distinguished audience. The topic of my contribution will be the relation between state sovereignty and global responsibility, as well as possibly the necessity to rethink sovereignty. Indeed, one of the features of the state, by the way, the slides I don't see where okay, perfect, thank you very much. One of the features of the state as a cold monster is surely its sovereignty. Therefore, I will concentrate my presentation on the question of whether sovereignty is still to be considered a value. In case that the answer is negative, or if we maintain that the notion has to be changed, then also the way in which we understand the state must inevitably be reconsidered. In fact, for a long time, questioning the value of sovereignty would have seemed senseless. As the beacon of the Westphalian setup of the Western world, sovereignty has dominated the Western political stage, and progressively, not only the Western, for a long, long time. However, facing with the stronger awareness of the dark side of sovereignty on the one hand, and with the inescapability of global cooperation, at least in some fields, on the other, it is now more than justified to ask whether sovereignty is still a value. To answer this question, it has to be specified first that for sovereignty to be a value, it should be essentially linked to a social good that is no less worth being protected in times of global interconnections than ever before. In other words, it is necessary to identify a good which is always essential for the functioning of society and to the definition of which sovereignty plays a fundamental role. On the basis of the conditions under which that good can be best preserved in our times, it will be possible to address the question whether sovereignty can still contribute to the task while maintaining the content that has been traditionally attributed to its concept, or it should be redefined so as to adapt to the new challenges. I propose that the good which is connected to sovereignty and on the basis of which the content of sovereignty is assessed be identified with social order. Indeed, little doubt can be raised on the fact that no society can exist without some form of social order. That means of rules that make interactions peaceful, predictable, and in the most favorable of cases, cooperative. Secondly, it is also indubitable that the notion of sovereignty has significantly contributed to how social order has been understood, with particular reference to the relations among political communities, but also, to some extent, to the way in which the individual communities have been internally organized. Thirdly, since the idea of social order has gone through some deep-going ruptures, which have changed how we define the well-ordered society, the question has to be addressed on whether sovereignty in its traditional form or in a renewed guise can still be regarded as a pillar of the kind of social order that is necessary to meet the current challenges. Thus, let us start by defining the concept of order. Order is an essential component of social life. More specifically, we can maintain that a society is to be considered well-ordered when it is ruled by individually accepted, collectively shared, and functionally effective norms. Those norms have to perform three different tasks. First, they make interaction among the members of the social community predictable. Secondly, conflict are conveyed into procedures so as to make them peaceful settlement possible, thus preventing disruptive consequences for social cohesion. Thirdly, rules guarantee a sufficient level of synergy between the members of the social community. Though necessary in general, social order may be defined in particular in quite different ways. In other words, we can identify a certain number of distinct understandings of how the society should be organized in order to be justifiably regarded as well-ordered. Those understandings make up what we can define as the as the paradigms of order. In a broad sense, a paradigm is a set of concepts that build the preconditions for the use of theoretical and practical reasoning in a certain time and related to a specific matter. Therefore, a paradigm of order is a set of fundamental concepts that specify the conditions for a society to be considered well-ordered. When the conditions of social life have changed so much that the concepts characterizing the predominant paradigm no longer meet the requirements for a justifiable idea of order, a so-called paradigmatic revolution takes place. As a result, a new conception of order is developed, which is assumed to be better capable of understanding and justifying the new social condition, as well as of giving a more correct advice for action. Every paradigm of order entails three claims concerning essential elements of its constitutive structure. The first claim refers to the extension of the well-ordered society. Is it inevitably limited in its range so that every social, political, ethnic, or religious community must have its own idea of order, which is incompatible with any other? Or could the well-ordered society comprise the whole humankind? The second claim regards the ontological basis of order. According to the holistic interpretation, it is the community in its entirety that provides the ontological basis, while the individuals are put in second place. Turning upside down the priority, in the individualistic understanding of order, it is the individuals who freely create the rules, and the society only exists to protect their rights and interests. The third claim is related to the question of whether the rules of a society, for this to be well ordered, need to be strictly consistent with each other and hierarchically organized, or order can also be conceived as a plurality of normative systems that overlap and dialogically interact with one another. The most ancient pattern of order maintained that a society, to be well ordered, must be particularistic as opposed to universalistic. That means limited in its range, holistic as opposed to individualistic, which means based on the supposedly organic community of its members, and unitary, namely based on a self-reliant, self-consistent, and hierarchical normative structure. This holistic paradigm, holistic particularistic, so to say, paradigm of order, dates back at least to ancient Greece, thus to well before the modern concept of sovereignty was formulated. Nonetheless, no doubts can exist on the fact that modern sovereignty entirely belongs to this paradigm. That the traditional concept of sovereignty is nothing but a variant of holistic particularism was already made intrinsically clear, obviously without any reference to the theory of the paradigms of order, by Jean Baudin as the great architect of the modern idea of sovereign power. Since sovereignty has been right from the outset one of the most fundamental conceptual pillars supporting the holistic particularistic paradigm of order, it is not surprising that four main contemporary variants of the paradigm still regard sovereignty as a crucial component of any well-ordered social, political, and legal community. According to a first present-day variant of holistic particularism championed, among others, by Martin Loughlin, sovereignty is deemed essential to social, political, and legal order because the rationality that lies at the basis of order would necessarily require free and firm acts of political will, carried out by a self-reliant entity that constitutes itself precisely through the creation of the constitutional framework of the polity. A second strand of contemporary holistic particularism, which we can find in the works of, in particular, of German constitutionalists like Josef Isense, Paul Kirchhoff, and Dieter Grimm, locates the roots of public power's legitimacy in the national identity of the people, of the folk. All exponents of this ethno-nationalistic strand of holistic particularism always maintained that rationality is inevitably embedded in the unique characteristics of the folk. As a result, defending the sovereignty of the nation is regarded as the most necessary condition to preserve the rational quality of the political and legal interaction and discourse, a quality that would be lost in the confusing turn to a cosmopolitan constitutionalism. According to a third approach of contemporary holistic particularism, social rationality essentially aims at finding the means for rejecting the threat coming from outside. The most rational endeavor consists, therefore, in organizing the friends in order to prepare for the existential struggle against the external enemies. Under these circumstances, an unrestricted sovereign power becomes a precious, even indispensable instrument to uphold the self-determination and the very existence of the political community. This understanding of sovereignty as essentially rooted in conflict was elaborated for the first time by Carl Schmitt and recently taken up by Samuel Huntington. The fourth and last variant of holistic particularism, which still puts sovereignty at the center of its idea of social, political, and legal order, focuses primarily on the criticism of international law. To strengthen the skepticism against the normative quality of international law, Jack Goldsmith and Derek Posner have recently applied the epistemological framework of rational choice to legal theory. Following the rational choice assumption that only selfishness is rational, a political community will only act rationally. It means it would increase its payoffs if it does not bind itself to suprastate rules, or if it does so only in the case that these rules are evidently at the service of its immediate interests. From this perspective, selfish policies and the upholding of an unrestrained sovereignty would be the most rational choice, simply because we cannot precisely know what the preferences of other polities are or what their next actions are going to be. Each one of these variants of contemporary holistic particularism has its own weaknesses and can be subjected to specific critiques. What is important here, however, is to stress that the traditional concept of sovereignty is central to all of them, making it still very influential in political thinking. Yet, holistic particularism did not remain unchallenged, so that if sovereignty was to survive even under the aegis of a different conception of order, its supporters had necessary to reshape the contours of its notion. One of the paradigmatic revolutions through which the conception of the well-ordered society went through during the centuries and even the millennia, not the first one yet, as we will see later, affected the claim regarding the ontological basis of social order. Following the holistic particularistic paradigm, the community as a whole is assumed as the basis of the well-ordered society, so that it is considered not only having more value in its totality than each one of the individual members of the community, but also than their total sum. The turn to individualism, first introduced by René Descartes with his theory of knowledge, was then extended by Thomas Hobbes to political philosophy. More specifically, he put the center of social order in the rights, interests, and rational capacity of the individuals, so that public power was only justified if it aimed at the protection of individual rights and interests. To underline the individualistic character of the foundation of public power, the establishment of political and legal institutions endowed with authority was regarded in the strand of modern political philosophy that began with Hobbes as the result of a contract, mostly of fictitious nature, among those who were willing to come together in order to form a body politic. Hobbes is generally regarded as the second founding father, along with Baudin, of the modern concept of sovereignty. However, there is a significant difference between the ideas of sovereignty, which can substantially be traced back to opposite approaches with reference to the question of the origin of public power. In Bourdieu's view, the political community is conceived as an enlarged family. Therefore, power, as well as authority, which can be defined as the implementation of power, descends from above, that means from a supposedly self-evident order of nature, to the person who wields power, and from these to those who are expected to abide by these rules. On the contrary, in Hobbes' view, the Commonwealth is not the original and axiologically highest entity in the ethical world, but rather a tool that humans give to themselves in order to achieve social stability. Thus, legitimacy of sovereign power is insofar ascending as it arises from the original freedom and self-reliance of the individuals who create the institution of public power through an autonomous act of will. Through the foundational contract, they transfer their original rights, or at least part of them, to the hereby created authority, with the purpose of guaranteeing an adequate protection of the subjective entitlements on the basis of a bottom-up legitimation process. Thus, according to modern contractualism, sovereignty is legitimate only if it aims at safeguarding fundamental rights and is grounded on a freely and explicitly expressed people's consent. Hobbes turned to an individualistic understanding of order, set the conditions for a deep-going redefinition of sovereignty. Nevertheless, the consequences of his revolutionary step did not become completely manifest in his work. It was rather with John Locke's liberalism, then with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's passionate defense of democracy, and finally with the deliberative theories of the late 20th century, that the notion of sovereign power uncompromisingly put the individuals at the center of order on the basis of an ascending or bottom-up idea of legitimation. Insofar as the community of those who were entitled to provide the legitimation of public power was progressively extended to comprise all citizens, the idea of sovereign power was finally qualified as people's or popular sovereignty. However, long before the transition from holism to individualism occurred, another paradigmatic revolution has changed the way in which social order was conceived. In this case, the claim affected did not regard the ontological basis of order, but its extension. According to the new approach, the well-ordered society was not assumed to be necessarily limited to the specific community any longer, but was rather believed to be capable in principle of including the whole humankind. The first paradigmatic revolution therefore marked the transition from particularism to universalism. While the first paradigmatic revolution reversed the claim regarding the extension of order, nothing changed with reference to the other contents of the paradigm. Social order was still based on the assumption of an organic ontologic fundament, and order had to be unitary. Therefore, due to its characteristics, the paradigm of order that emerged from the first paradigmatic revolution can be defined as holistic universalism. The notion of a universal order was probably introduced for the first time in the history of thought by the Buddhist philosophy, through the concept of Dharma as the natural order of the universe. A couple of centuries later, the same turn toward universalism was taken in the Western world by the Stoic philosophy. Stoicism was rather alien to the world, and so was also its cosmopolitan proposal. Yet many elements of its conception were passed to the nascent Christian philosophy. Significantly, both the cosmopolitan idea of order and the concept of a universal natural reason, as well as of a natural law which is assumed to be based on it, were among them. In fact, having the idea of the cosmopolitan human community being made depending on the worldwide predominance of only one religion, Christian universalism was flawed from the very outset. As a result, starting from the 17th century, Western supporters of universalism progressively cut the ties with its religious component while trying to ground cosmopolitanism on purely rational justifications. However, regardless whether the arguments in favor of universalism were religious or not, the perspectives for the supporters of sovereignty under the dominance of the universalistic paradigm of order could not but be dire. Indeed, according to the Christian theology of the Middle Ages, state sovereignty was ultimately reduced to almost nothing under the unlimited dominance of the papacy, which was assumed to possess not only the highest spiritual power, but also the highest temporal authority. The Catholic theology can be seen as the legitimate heir of its medieval predecessor, carried on largely the same view, albeit modernized through some adjustments. On the Protestant side of modern Christian thinking, instead, there was a well-grounded mistrust of political and religious universalism, which reminded respectively of imperial oppression and papist persecution. The result was that more room was given to the sovereignty of individual states. This option implied that the only foundation for a worldwide order was located in the assumption of a universal validity of human reason. While the idea of a cosmopolitan order was thereby made independent of the intrinsically discriminatory pretension of a worldwide authority under Christian rule, the turn to purely natural law as the basis of universalism also marked a step backwards, inasmuch as it gave up on the political and legal formulation of the cosmopolis. Being conceived all in terms of general principles of natural law, the ideal world order remained a matter for comforters, while world constitutionalism, if properly understood, necessarily needs a clearly identifiable legal framework. The step to the establishment of a cosmopolitan legal order was taken by Kant. In particular, he introduced for the first time a tripartition of public law, in which the third part, going from the most specific to the most general and inclusive, is what he unequivocally defined as cosmopolitan law, or jus cosmopoliticum. Beside the law of the state as the first part of his system of public law, and the law between states, or international law as the second part of it, cosmopolitan law included principles and rules that govern the interactions between human beings as such, regardless of their respective national belonging and citizenship. Slightly more than a century after Kant's writings and following a long period in which a renaissance of sovereignty under the aegis of nationalism had dominated the political stage, the apotheosis on the way to the legalization of universalism was reached in the work of Hans Kelsen. His courageous proposal aimed at creating a radically monist legal system, in which international law was put for the first time in the history of legal theory at the apex of the hierarchy of norms. As a result, state law, even constitutional law, was authorized to govern social interaction only within the framework established by international law. As he openly admitted, Kelsen's construction of the legal system was destined to end any serious pretension of sovereignty by the single states. Indeed, from the viewpoint of Kelsen's pacifism, sovereignty is essentially an ideological instrument for the justification of political selfishness and aggression, thus unequivocally at odds with any serious idea of cosmopolitan order. And on the other hand, a thoroughly legalized and centralized order like the one for which Kelsen pleaded has also its downsides. Indeed, the notion of sovereignty not only symbolizes the self-reliant defiance by the individual political community against any prospect of a well-ordered worldwide society, but also stands, if understood as citizen sovereignty, for democratic self-government and for the values of freedom and justice which are enshrined into national constitutions. At this point, we seem to face an irresolvable dilemma. Either we opt for the radical cosmopolitanism of a worldwide system of institutions and binding norms, with the consequence that we would nourish the hope, though distant, to foster universal justice and peace, but at the cost not only of pursuing an ideal that verts on a chimera, but also of putting at risk the principle of self-government and constitutional freedom, or we prefer sovereignty, with the promise of political autonomy and constitutional freedom, but also with a substantial indifference towards the responsibility that we bear towards those humans who are not members of our political community. Yet, this responsibility is unquestionable. First, because we all share the same planet and the problems that affect it lastly touch us all. Secondly, because we interact with fellow humans far beyond the borders of our nation. And thirdly, decisions taken by a political community, in particular by the most powerful ones, may impact on the quality of life of individuals far beyond its borders. A decisive help to break the stalemate was offered by the third radical change regarding the way in which the well-ordered society is understood. The third paradigmatic revolution in the theories of order occurred just a few decades ago and involved what has been described before as the third element that is always present in a paradigm of order, namely the assertion concerning the unitary or non-unitary character of a well-ordered society. Regardless of whether they were particularistic or universalistic on the one hand, holistic or individualistic on the other, the paradigms of order before the third paradigmatic revolution were all characterized by unitary idea of order. In other words, in all these previous paradigms, the institutional structure and the system of norms are considered well ordered only if they are organized as a coherent, vertical, and hierarchical unity, or as a pyramid in which conflicts between different institutions and norms have to be resolved by defining which institution or norm, respectively, has priority over the conflicting one. Instead, the third paradigmatic revolution has paved the way for an understanding of order in which the well-ordered society is conceived of as a polyarchic, horizontal, and interconnected structure that reminds us more of a network than of a pyramid. Among the different patterns of order that emerge from the turn to a pluralist idea of the well-ordered society, the communicative paradigm provides the most useful organ for the redefinition of the notion of sovereignty. According to the fundamental assumption of the communicative paradigm, society is made up of a live world of intersubjective relations, which is characterized by different forms of interaction. Put differently, social life has a variety of dimensions corresponding to the diversity of our social needs, and each interaction has the task of developing one of those dimensions. More specifically, we can identify two forms of political interaction, both of them focusing on the question about how we should respond to the questions of common concern. The first refers to discourses addressing the organization of public life within a limited territory and with reference to the community of individuals living in the territory, or to those individuals who, even though not living there, maintain nevertheless a special relationship to the territory and to its community. This is what we can call a national political community, which is here understood as a nation of citizens, thus being devoid of any ethnic connotation. In order to include into the discourse all citizens of the national political community, the questions addressed in the national political discourse must have a rather practical content, being limited to issues like the distribution of resources, the organization of the social subsystems, and the form of government. Consequently, the identity forged by the common interaction concerning the question on how to respond to questions of common concern within the borders of a limited political community is not substantive, in the sense that it does not aim at touching on a deep existential dimension. Rather, it is formal, inasmuch as it is centered around the interiorization of the rules of political communication. Within the formal framework of political rules, each existential, cultural, or religious community can find the proper space to thrive and cultivate its interests. The second form of political interaction refers to the fact that individuals also meet and interact with one another outside the borders of single states, regardless of their belonging to a specific political community. This level of interaction is also governed by law, more precisely by the corpus juris of cosmopolitan law, consisting of those principles and rules that guarantee a peaceful and cooperative interaction between humans within the most general context of communication, namely beyond the condition of being citizens of an individual state. Embedded in these rules and principles, the fundamental recognition that we owe to every human being as the consequence of the universal capacity to communicate. The discourse of cosmopolitan interaction, shaped by cosmopolitan law, addresses the question on how to respond to questions of common concern to the whole humankind. Following the communicative paradigm, every one of us participates in a number of different interactions, while maintaining nonetheless his or her personal and distinctive integrity. This implies a significant novelty as regards the relation between the national and the cosmopolitan communities. Indeed, according to the previously analyzed paradigms of all, the individual is always seen either as belonging to a limited and particularistic polity, or as being essentially part of the worldwide community of humankind. Instead, if we consider the issues from the viewpoint of the communicative paradigm, each individual is at the same time and without irresolvable contradictions a citizen of a specific national society and a member of the universal community of humankind. Therefore, as citizens of a national community, the individuals take part in decision-making processes that foster domestic interests. But since they are also members of the global communication community, domestic decisions must be weighed against the obligation that we have towards our fellow humans on a global scale. On that basis, sovereignty can be maintained as a fundamental expression of the self-government of the political community, while global responsibility is reaffirmed at the same time. Against the theoretical background of communicative rationality, sovereignty cannot be considered as absolute any longer, but only as relative, in the sense that the affirmation of self-determination has always to be compatible with the obligation towards individuals who do not belong to the political community, but are nevertheless affected by its decisions. To the extent that the change in the understanding of order introduced by the paradigmatic revolutions can arguably be considered an improvement, sovereignty is still to be regarded as a value, only if it is proved that its concept can be adapted to the progressive reinterpretation of the well-ordered society. This leads to the conclusion that sovereignty, to have a value in our times, must be given a fundamentally different meaning than originally intended. Indeed, sovereignty, as it was framed by Baudin, meant nothing more than the assertion that public power does not have to recognize any superior or equivalent power in its domain. To the extent that the question of legitimacy was addressed, Baudin was content to draw it from natural law. Nor has the position of the supporters of the traditional concept of sovereignty much changed in recent times. Yet, the paradigmatic revolution from holism to individualism made clear that the legitimation of public power by the citizens matters, so that sovereignty can be accepted only if it comes from the people. Furthermore, full legitimacy is exclusively given under the condition that all aspects of the acting and legitimating individuals are brought into play. In other words, and concluding, if the dimension of the individuals as citizens of a specific political community is realized through their participation in the national decision-making processes, they are no less essential, faced as members of the community of humankind, as to be implemented through the responsibility that the sovereign polity shows towards the others. Drawing the strands together, an updated and normatively upgraded notion of sovereignty means that the political power qualifies as sovereign if it is legitimated by the citizens, and while keeping in mind the interests of the polity, also acts as a trustee of humanity. Thank you very much.